The HOA president broke into my cabin at night, and what I discovered him doing at 2 in the morning would change everything between us forever. I jolted awake to the sound of something that didn't belong in the mountain silence, my heart hammering against my ribs as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. There it was again, a soft shuffling from the living room below, followed by the unmistakable creak of my grandfather's old floorboards. My blood turned to ice. I was alone up here, 40 miles from the nearest neighbor, in a cabin that had been my sanctuary for the past 3 years. The kind of place where you don't lock doors because the only visitors are deer and the occasional black bear. But tonight, something human was moving through my home. I slipped out of bed, bare feet silent on the cold wood, and crept to the top of the stairs. The faint glow of a flashlight beam danced across my living room walls, and I could hear someone muttering under their breath. My mind raced through possibilities. A burglar? Some drunk hiker who got lost? Then I heard a voice that made my stomach drop. Unbelievable. Look at all this junk scattered around. Clear violation of community standards. Richard Pemberton, the HOA president of Pine Ridge Community, the man who had made my life hell for months. But what was he doing in my cabin at 2 in the morning, going through my personal belongings like he owned the place? I watched from the shadows as his flashlight illuminated my grandfather's old fishing tackle box. Richard was methodically photographing everything with his phone, muttering notes about unsightly clutter and property value concerns. He moved to my bookshelf next, running his fingers along the spines like he was conducting some kind of inspection. The audacity hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a complete violation of everything I held sacred. My cabin wasn't even part of his precious HOA jurisdiction. I'd checked the property lines a dozen times when the harassment started. This place sat on 5 acres that my grandfather had owned since 1952. Grandfather claused out of any homeowner association nonsense. But here was Richard, treating my home like it was his personal kingdom to inspect whenever he pleased. He picked up my coffee mug from the morning, still sitting on the side table, and I watched him photograph it from 3 different angles. Then he opened my mail stack, actually opened my mail, and started photographing the envelopes. Property management violations? Check. Unsecured correspondence? Check. He was talking to himself like he was conducting some official investigation, but the smugness in his voice made it clear this was personal. That's when I realized this wasn't random. This was calculated, methodical, and completely insane. Richard had driven 40 miles up a mountain road, hiked the last quarter mile because the winter access was gated, and broken into my private residence to gather what he probably considered evidence of HOA violations that didn't even apply to my property. He moved to my kitchen next, opening cabinets and photographing the contents. My grandfather's old cast iron skillets, my collection of mason jars, the wooden spice rack I'd built myself last summer. Everything was being documented like it was some kind of crime scene. I gripped the stair railing until my knuckles went white. Part of me wanted to storm down there and confront him immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the lawyer instincts I'd inherited from my father, or maybe it was pure survival instinct. But I knew I needed to let this play out. I needed to see exactly how far Richard was willing to go. He was in my bedroom now. I could hear him moving around, opening drawers, that flashlight beam sweeping across surfaces that no stranger had any right to touch. The violation felt like ice water in my veins. This was my sanctuary, my escape from the corporate world, the place where I came to remember who I was before deadlines and conference calls consumed my life. And Richard Pemberton was treating it like his personal property to inspect at will. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The audio was clear enough to pick up his muttered commentary, his footsteps, the sound of him rifling through my private belongings. Whatever game Richard thought he was playing, he had no idea what he'd just walked into. Because Richard Pemberton, in all his petty tyrannical glory, had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed I was just another intimidated homeowner he could bully into submission. He had no idea that my late father's best friend, the man who'd been like an uncle to me since childhood, happened to be Judge Harrison Mitchell of the County Superior Court. This cabin wasn't just property to me. It was the last connection I had to the only man who ever truly understood what it meant to live free. My grandfather, William Chen, bought these 5 acres in 1952 with money he'd saved from working double shifts at the lumber mill, back when this mountain was nothing but wilderness and dreams. He built every beam, laid every stone, carved every detail by hand over 3 summers, while my grandmother packed sandwiches and complained about the mosquitoes. Growing up, this place was magic. While other kids spent summers at expensive camps or glued to video games, I learned to fish in Willow Creek, to identify every bird call in the forest, to read weather patterns in cloud formations. Grandpa taught me that real wealth wasn't about what you owned, but about the peace you could find in spaces untouched by other people's opinions. When he passed 2 years ago at 91, he left me the cabin and a letter that I still kept in my wallet. "Danny," it read in his careful handwriting, "this place isn't just wood and stone. It's proof that a man can carve out something beautiful in this world without asking permission from committees or associations. Don't ever let anyone tell you what to do with it." I'd moved here permanently 6 months ago when the corporate grind finally broke something inside me that couldn't be fixed with vacation days and stress management seminars. The cabin became my office, my gym, my church, my entire world. I ran my consulting business from the kitchen table, took client calls from the front porch, and slept better than I had in 15 years of city living. But that peace shattered the moment Pine Ridge Community Association discovered my existence. It started innocently enough. Richard Pemberton showed up one Tuesday morning in his ridiculous white BMW, wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's rent, carrying a clipboard like it was a royal scepter. He introduced himself as the HOA president and informed me that my property, despite being outside their official boundaries, was subject to their community standards because it was visible from Pine Ridge roads. I laughed. Actually laughed out loud right in his face. I explained that my grandfather's property predated their little planned community by 60 years, that I wasn't a member of their association, and that he could take his community standards and file them somewhere anatomically impossible. That's when Richard's mask slipped. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by the cold stare of a man who wasn't used to being told no. He looked around my property like he was cataloging every imperfection, every deviation from his vision of suburban perfection. "Mr. Chin," he said, making my name sound like a curse, "you may think you're above our community standards, but I assure you there are ways to ensure compliance. Property values affect everyone in this area, and your lifestyle choices are becoming a problem." My lifestyle choices. I was maintaining a beautiful mountain retreat, exactly as my grandfather had intended, living quietly, bothering no one. But in Richard's world, anything that didn't conform to his cookie-cutter vision was a threat to be eliminated. The harassment began immediately. Citations for unsightly outdoor equipment because I kept my grandfather's old canoe visible from the road. Complaints to the county about my unpermitted structures, despite having every document proving the cabin's legal status dating back to 1952. Anonymous reports to environmental agencies about my wood-burning stove, my gravel driveway, even my vegetable garden. Every week brought a new assault. Richard would drive by at odd hours, taking photographs, measuring distances, looking for any excuse to drag me into compliance. He recruited neighbors I'd never met to file formal complaints. He even convinced the Postal Service to investigate whether my rural mailbox met current regulations. But the final straw came 3 weeks ago when I found surveyors on my property at dawn, measuring boundaries and marking trees. When I confronted them, they showed me authorization papers signed by Richard Pemberton, claiming he was investigating encroachment issues between my property and the Pine Ridge community. I ran them off and called Richard immediately. His response chilled me to the bone. "Mr. Chen, one way or another, your non-compliance will be addressed. If you won't voluntarily bring your property up to community standards, we'll find other ways to ensure the integrity of our neighborhood." The threat was clear, but vague enough to be legally meaningless. Richard was telling me he'd escalate until I either conformed or gave up and sold. He saw my grandfather's legacy, my sanctuary, as nothing more than an obstacle to his perfect planned community vision. What he didn't understand was that this cabin represented everything my grandfather had fought against. The committees, the associations, the petty tyrants who thought they could dictate how free people lived on their own land. Tonight's break-in wasn't just criminal trespassing. It was Richard declaring war on everything my family had built, everything that mattered to me. I made my decision as Richard's footsteps approached the bottom of the stairs. No more hiding, no more watching this violation unfold in silence. I walked down those steps like I owned them, because I did, and flipped on every light in the house. Well, well, well. Richard Pemberton, breaking and entering at 2 in the morning. Should I be flattered by the personal visit, or just call the sheriff right now? He spun around so fast his flashlight flew out of his hand, clattering across the hardwood floor. For a split second, I saw genuine terror in his eyes, the look of a man caught doing something he knew was completely indefensible. But Richard was nothing if not adaptable. The fear vanished, replaced by that same arrogant smirk that had been poisoning my life for months. "Mr. Chen, good, you're awake. I was hoping we could have a conversation about the serious violations I've documented tonight." The audacity was breathtaking. He was standing in my living room, uninvited, at 2 in the morning, holding a phone full of photographs of my private belongings, and he wanted to talk about violations. I stared at him, genuinely impressed by the sheer scope of his delusion. "Violations? Richard, you just committed felony breaking and entering. You're holding evidence of criminal trespassing in your hands. And you want to discuss violations?" He straightened his polo shirt and picked up his flashlight, composing himself like this was a routine business meeting. "Mr. Chen, as the elected representative of the Pine Ridge Community Association, I have both the right and the responsibility to investigate property standards, violations that affect our community's value and safety. You have no authority here, none. This property isn't part of your association, never has been, never will be. You're a trespasser who broke into my home in the middle of the night." Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photographs he'd taken. "I've documented extensive evidence of code violations, unsanitary conditions, and property mismanagement. Exposed food storage, unsecured personal items, failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. That exposed food storage is my coffee mug. Those unsecured personal items are my books. And community aesthetic standards don't apply to property that isn't in your community." He looked at me like I was a particularly slow child who couldn't grasp basic concepts. "Mr. Chen, your property is visible from Pine Ridge roads. That makes it part of our community's visual landscape. Property values within a 5-mile radius are directly impacted by what residents and potential buyers see when they drive through our area." I felt something snap inside my chest, a sound like breaking glass that I'd been holding back for months. "So you broke into my house to photograph my coffee mug because it might affect property values. I entered this structure to conduct a necessary inspection after numerous reports of potential health and safety violations. What I found confirms our worst concerns about your impact on community standards. Richard began scrolling through his photos again, narrating like he was presenting evidence to a jury. Exposed food containers? Check. Unsecured reading materials scattered throughout common areas? Check. Vintage cookware that doesn't meet modern safety standards? Check. Personal correspondence left in plain view? Check. You photographed my mail, Richard. You opened my mail and photographed it. I documented potential security vulnerabilities that could impact the broader community. If your personal information is compromised due to negligent storage practices, that creates risks for everyone in the area. The man had an answer for everything, each more insane than the last. In Richard's world, my coffee mug was a code violation, my grandfather's cast iron skillets were safety hazards, and my privacy was a community security risk. Here's what's going to happen, Richard. You're going to delete every photograph you took tonight. Then you're going to leave my property and never come back. Or I'm calling the sheriff and having you arrested for breaking and entering. He laughed. Actually laughed, like I'd told him a particularly amusing joke. Mr. Chen, you clearly don't understand the legal realities of your situation. These photographs document legitimate community standards violations. Deleting them would be destruction of evidence. And as for calling the sheriff, I think you'll find that my documentation of your property management failures provides more than sufficient justification for tonight's inspection. Inspection? You broke into my house? I conducted a community standards assessment of a property that has been the subject of multiple legitimate complaints. The fact that you're hostile to accountability only confirms that our concerns were justified. Richard pocketed his phone and picked up his clipboard, which apparently he'd brought along for this midnight inspection. Mr. Chen, I'm prepared to be reasonable. Full compliance with Pine Ridge community standards, including removal of all vintage equipment, modernization of outdoor storage, and regular maintenance inspections, and we can resolve this matter without further escalation. I stared at him, genuinely amazed that such concentrated arrogance could exist in one human being. Get out of my house, Richard. I'll be filing a full report with the appropriate authorities tomorrow. You'll be hearing from us soon. As I watched Richard drive away into the night, his taillights disappearing down the mountain road, the full weight of what had just happened settled over me. This wasn't the first time Richard had crossed lines that shouldn't exist, but it was the most egregious escalation in a campaign that had been building for months. And as I sat in my violated living room, I realized I needed to document every single incident that had led to this moment. The pattern started small, the way these things always do. 3 months after my first encounter with Richard, I found a formal citation tucked under my windshield wiper. Notice of community standards violation, unsightly outdoor equipment. The citation included a photograph of my grandfather's canoe, the same aluminum vessel he'd used to explore every lake within 50 miles, now apparently classified as an eyesore because it was visible from the county road. I called Richard directly, thinking this had to be some kind of mistake. His response was clinical, rehearsed. Mr. Chen, while your property may not be technically within our boundaries, the visual impact of non-conforming outdoor equipment affects the entire community's property values. We're simply asking for voluntary compliance. Voluntary compliance. The phrase would become Richard's favorite euphemism for forced conformity. 2 weeks later, county inspectors showed up at my door, clipboard in hand, claiming they'd received reports about unpermitted additions to my property. They spent 3 hours measuring my grandfather's workshop, the tool shed, even the wooden steps leading to my front door. Every structure built before 1960, every improvement grandfathered by decades of legal precedent. The inspectors apologized profusely when they realized the complaints were baseless, but the message was clear. Richard had connections, resources, and the persistence to weaponize bureaucracy against anyone who defied his vision of suburban perfection. The environmental harassment came next. Anonymous reports to the EPA about my wood-burning stove, despite the fact that it was fully compliant with all federal and state regulations. Complaints to the Forest Service about my unauthorized hiking trails, paths that had existed since my grandfather first cleared them in the 1950s. A visit from fish and wildlife officers investigating reports of illegal fishing activities in Willow Creek, the same creek where my grandfather had taught me to cast a line 30 years ago. Each investigation ended the same way. Apologies from confused officials who couldn't understand why they'd been sent to investigate a man living quietly on his own property. But each false report meant hours of my time, stress, and the gradual erosion of my peace of mind. Richard's next escalation targeted my livelihood. He somehow discovered I ran a consulting business from my cabin and reported me to the county for operating a commercial enterprise in a residential area. Never mind that consulting work was perfectly legal on rural property, or that I had zero walk-in customers disrupting any neighbors. The investigation took 6 weeks and cost me $3,000 in legal fees to resolve. But Richard wasn't finished. He convinced 2 neighbors I'd never met to file formal noise complaints about my morning coffee routine. Apparently, grinding beans at 7 a.m. constituted a disruptive morning disturbance that violated community quiet hours. The sheriff who responded to the complaint actually laughed when he realized he'd been called out because someone made coffee. The postal harassment was perhaps the most petty. Richard filed complaints, claiming my rural mailbox didn't meet current USPS regulations for height, distance from the road, and reflective visibility standards. 3 different postal inspectors verified that my mailbox was perfectly compliant, but not before weeks of uncertainty about whether my mail delivery would be suspended. Then came the surveyor incident that finally revealed Richard's true intentions. I woke up at sunrise 3 weeks ago to find 2 men with measuring equipment marking trees on my property line. When I confronted them, they showed me work orders signed by Richard Pemberton, authorizing them to investigate boundary disputes and potential encroachment issues. The surveyors were confused when I explained that no boundary disputes existed, that my property lines had been clearly established for 70 years. They packed up their equipment and left, but not before admitting they'd been hired to look for any possible basis to challenge my property rights. That night, Richard called me personally. His voice was calm, professional, completely reasonable. "Mr. Chen, I want you to understand that this situation can be resolved amicably. Full compliance with Pine Ridge standards, regular maintenance inspections, and a commitment to community aesthetic harmony. Otherwise, we'll continue pursuing every legal avenue available to ensure neighborhood integrity." The threat was elegant in its vagueness. He wasn't just trying to force compliance anymore. He was trying to drive me away entirely, to make my life so miserable that I'd sell and leave, clearing the way for his perfect planned community vision. Every citation, every false report, every manufactured crisis had been building toward tonight's break-in. Richard had escalated from harassment to stalking to criminal trespassing, convinced that his community standards gave him the right to invade my home at will. After Richard's taillights disappeared into the darkness, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the spots where his flashlight had violated my privacy. The rage was still there, burning like acid in my chest, but something else was building underneath it. Something that felt like the moment before lightning strikes. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. Judge Harrison Mitchell. Uncle Harry to me, though we shared no blood. The man who'd stood beside my father at law school graduation, who'd been the best man at my parents' wedding, who'd taught me to play chess on Sunday afternoons, while my grandfather taught me to fish. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but Harry had always been a night owl. The phone rang twice before his familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Danny, everything all right, son?" "Uncle Harry, I need to tell you something." and I need your advice on how to handle it legally." "Hold on, let me get to my study." Sarah's still sleeping. I could hear him moving through his house, the same house where I'd spent countless childhood evenings, where he'd helped me with homework and listened to my teenage problems with the patience of a saint. Harry Mitchell had been like a second father to me after my dad died, the steady presence who'd guided me through law school applications and career decisions. "All right, I'm here. What's going on?" I told him everything. The months of harassment, the false reports, the escalating intimidation. And then I told him about tonight, about finding Richard Pemberton in my cabin at 2 in the morning, photographing my personal belongings like he had some divine right to inspect my home. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a full minute. When Harry finally spoke, his voice had changed. Gone was the warm uncle tone, replaced by something colder, more precise. The voice of a man who'd spent 30 years on the bench, dealing with people who thought they were above the law. "Danny, tell me exactly what this man said to justify being in your home." I recounted the conversation word for word, Richard's insane justifications, his claims about community standards and visual landscapes. Harry listened without interruption, and I could practically hear him taking notes in his head. "And you have recordings of this encounter?" "Video and audio." Clear enough to make out his face and every word he said. "Good. Danny, what you've described isn't just harassment. This man has committed multiple felonies. Breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, stalking, abuse of process in filing false reports. And if he's been coordinating with government agencies to harass you based on fabricated complaints, that's potentially conspiracy and civil rights violations under color of law." The legal terminology felt like weapons being loaded into my arsenal. For months, I'd been thinking of this as a neighborhood dispute that had gotten out of hand. But Harry was right. Richard hadn't just crossed a line tonight. He'd obliterated it. "Here's what's going to happen," Harry continued. And now I could hear the judge in his voice, the authority that had commanded courtrooms for 3 decades. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to file criminal complaints for breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, and stalking. I'll make some calls to ensure those complaints get the attention they deserve." "Uncle Harry, I don't want special treatment because of our relationship." "Danny, this isn't about special treatment. This is about a career criminal who's been using fraudulent complaints to weaponize government agencies against a private citizen. Every false report he filed is a separate crime. Every time he used his position to intimidate you is abuse of authority. This man has been conducting what amounts to a terrorism campaign against you for months." The word terrorism hit me like a physical blow, but it was accurate. Richard had been using fear, intimidation, and the threat of legal consequences to control my behavior, to force me off my own property. "There's something else, Danny. This pattern you've described, the escalating harassment, the false complaints, the break-in, this isn't this man's first rodeo. People like Richard Pemberton don't usually limit their abuse to one target. I'm willing to bet there are other victims in that community who've been too afraid or too isolated to fight back." I thought about the surveyor incident, Richard's casual mention of multiple legitimate complaints. How many other homeowners had he terrorized into compliance? How many had simply given up and moved away rather than fight his campaign of harassment? "Uncle Harry, what do you think his endgame was? What was he actually trying to accomplish?" "Power, Danny. Pure and simple. Men like Richard get drunk on the ability to control other people's lives. Your grandfather's property represents everything he can't control, can't standardize, can't force into his vision of suburban perfection. So he decided to destroy it. The pieces clicked into place. This had never been about property values or community standards. This was about a petty tyrant who couldn't tolerate the existence of anything outside his authority. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The violation, the anger, the months of accumulated stress had crystallized into something sharp and focused. Richard Pemberton wanted to play legal games. Fine. But he was about to discover the difference between weaponizing bureaucracy and facing actual justice. My first call was to Detective Sarah Martinez at the County Sheriff's Office. Harry had given me her direct number, explaining that she specialized in residential crimes and had a particular hatred for people who abused positions of authority. When I explained the situation, her response was immediate and professional. "Mr. Chen, can you be here at 9 a.m. with all your evidence? I want to see those recordings, and I want copies of every false complaint this man has filed against you." I spent the morning organizing everything. The video of Richard's break-in, clear as daylight, showing his face and recording every word of his insane justifications. Screenshots of every citation he'd sent me. Documentation of every false complaint to government agencies. Phone records showing the pattern of harassment calls. Even photographs of the surveyor incident 3 weeks ago. Detective Martinez reviewed everything with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen this kind of abuse before. She watched the break-in video twice, taking notes, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "Mr. Chen, in 15 years of law enforcement, I've never seen someone document their own crimes this thoroughly. This man literally filmed himself committing felony breaking and entering while explaining his motivations for the camera." She pulled up Richard's background on her computer, and what she found was enlightening. 3 complaints filed against him for harassment in his previous neighborhood. 2 restraining orders requested by former neighbors, both dismissed due to lack of evidence. A pattern of using HOA authority to target homeowners who didn't conform to his standards. "This man is a serial abuser," Martinez said, printing out the background report. "He uses his HOA position like a weapon, and he's been getting away with it because most people don't know how to fight back or don't have the resources to pursue legal action." My phone rang while we were reviewing the evidence. Richard Pemberton, calling as promised to discuss my compliance violations. Detective Martinez gestured for me to answer and put it on speaker. "Mr. Chen, I trust you've had time to consider our discussion last night. I'm prepared to offer you one final opportunity to resolve this situation amicably." "Really, Richard? And what exactly are you proposing?" "Full compliance with Pine Ridge Community Standards within 30 days. Removal of all non-conforming outdoor equipment, modernization of your property's aesthetic elements, and agreement to quarterly maintenance inspections. In exchange, we'll withdraw our pending complaints with various regulatory agencies." Detective Martinez was taking notes, recording the call, documenting Richard's attempt to extort compliance through threats of continued harassment. I looked at her, and she nodded for me to keep him talking. "And if I refuse?" "Mr. Chen, I think last night's inspection demonstrates our commitment to ensuring community standards. We have extensive documentation of violations, and we're prepared to pursue every available legal remedy to protect our neighborhood's property values." There it was. Richard was threatening to repeat last night's break-in, using it as leverage to force my compliance. He'd just confessed to criminal intent on a recorded line with a detective listening. "I'll consider your proposal, Richard. Can I call you back this afternoon?" "Of course. But Danny, I want you to understand that this is your last chance to resolve this reasonably. After today, we move to more aggressive enforcement measures." After he hung up, Detective Martinez was already filling out arrest warrants. "Mr. Chen, that man just threatened to commit additional crimes if you don't submit to his demands. That's extortion, criminal coercion, and conspiracy to commit burglary." My next stop was Harry's office at the courthouse. Judge Harrison Mitchell's chambers were exactly as I remembered from childhood visits, lined with law books and filled with the weight of decades of judicial authority. Harry reviewed the evidence with the same careful attention Detective Martinez had shown, but I could see something else in his expression. Personal anger. Danny, this man violated more than your property. He violated the fundamental principle that a person's home is their sanctuary. But more than that, he's corrupted the legal system by filing false complaints and weaponizing government agencies. Harry pulled out his phone and made a call to the district attorney's office. Margaret, it's Harry Mitchell. I'm sending you a case that's going to require special prosecution. Multiple felonies, civil rights violations, abuse of process. The defendant has been conducting a sustained campaign of legal terrorism against a private citizen. While Harry coordinated with the DAI called my insurance company to document the break-in, my security company to install cameras and upgraded locks, and my attorney to begin preparing civil lawsuits for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of privacy. By 5 p.m., we had arrest warrants issued, criminal complaints filed, and a coordinated law enforcement response planned. Richard had spent months building his case against me, photographing my coffee mug, and measuring my grandfather's canoe. 3 weeks later, I sat in the gallery of Judge Mitchell's courtroom, watching Richard Pemberton discover what real authority looked like. He'd strutted in wearing his most expensive suit, flanked by 2 high-priced attorneys, radiating the same arrogant confidence that had carried him through months of harassing me. That confidence was about to be surgically removed. District Attorney Margaret Sullivan had assembled a prosecution team that treated this case like the organized crime it was. They'd spent 3 weeks investigating Richard's pattern of abuse, and what they'd found was staggering. 7 other homeowners in the Pine Ridge area who'd been subjected to similar harassment campaigns. Dozens of false complaints filed with government agencies. Evidence of Richard using his HOA position to target anyone who wouldn't submit to his vision of suburban control. Richard's first mistake was pleading not guilty to all charges. His attorneys had apparently convinced him that the break-in could be justified as a community standards inspection, that his position as HOA president granted him some kind of special authority. They were about to learn otherwise. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a no-nonsense veteran who'd earned her reputation by destroying people who abused the legal system, called the court to order. Harry had recused himself from the case due to our relationship, but he'd handpicked Hendricks specifically because she despised bullies who hid behind bureaucratic authority. Dia Sullivan opened with the security footage from my cabin. The courtroom fell silent as Richard's image filled the large screen, flashlight in hand, methodically photographing my personal belongings while muttering about community standards violations. His voice came through crystal clear as he documented my coffee mug, my books, my mail. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you're watching is not a community inspection. This is a man breaking into a private residence at 2 in the morning to satisfy his obsession with controlling his neighbor's life. Richard's attorney objected repeatedly, trying to introduce HOA bylaws and community standards documents, but Judge Hendricks shut them down every time. Counselor, no HOA bylaw grants authority to break into someone's home. Move on. The testimony phase was devastating. Detective Martinez walked the jury through Richard's background, the pattern of harassment, the escalating threats. She played the recorded phone call where Richard essentially confessed to extortion, threatening more aggressive enforcement if I didn't comply with his demands. But the moment that destroyed Richard completely came when Dia Sullivan called Maria Santos to testify. A 73-year-old widow who lived 2 miles from me, Maria broke down in tears as she described Richard's 18-month campaign to force her off her property. He said my late husband's garden shed was an eyesore. He filed complaints with the county every week. False reports about my septic system, my well water, my driveway. When I couldn't afford to fight anymore, when the stress was making me sick, I sold my home for half what it was worth just to make him stop. 3 more victims testified. A young couple who'd been driven into bankruptcy, defending against Richard's false complaints. An elderly man who'd suffered a heart attack after months of harassment. A single mother who'd lost custody time with her children because Richard's complaints had triggered child services investigations. Richard's attorneys tried to present him as a dedicated community leader concerned about property values, but the jury's faces told the story. They weren't seeing a concerned neighbor. They were seeing a predator who'd been systematically destroying lives for his own satisfaction. The defense's case collapsed when Richard insisted on testifying in his own defense. Despite his attorney's obvious panic, Richard took the stand convinced he could explain his way out of criminal charges. Dee Sullivan destroyed him methodically. She walked him through every false complaint, every harassment call, every abuse of his HOA position. When she reached the break-in, Richard's arrogance finally cracked. "Mr. Pemberton, you photographed Mr. Chen's coffee mug and called it a community standards violation. How exactly does a coffee mug threaten property values?" The accumulated effect of multiple violations creates a pattern of property mismanagement that impacts the entire area's desirability. "So you broke into his home at 2 a.m. to photograph a coffee mug because it might affect your neighbor's property values?" "I conducted a necessary inspection of documented violations that had been reported through proper channels." Mr. Pemberton, who reported Mr. Chen's coffee mug as a violation, the silence stretched for 30 seconds. Richard's face went through several color changes before he finally spoke. "The violations were self-evident upon inspection. So you broke into a man's home to look for violations that no one had reported, then photographed his personal belongings to create evidence of violations you invented yourself." Richard's yes was barely audible, but it rang through the courtroom like a confession of guilt. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. Guilty on all counts: breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, stalking, harassment, abuse of process, extortion, and conspiracy. Judge Hendricks scheduled sentencing for the following week, denying bail because Richard represented a clear and continuing threat to community safety. As the bailiffs led Richard away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with pure hatred. The man who'd spent months trying to control my life was finally facing consequences he couldn't manipulate or escape.